Good evening. I'm Matthew McClendon, the Director and CEO of the McNay Art Museum. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Tobin Distinguished Lecture, one of the signature programs that McNay presents each year. This evening celebrates the extraordinary intersection of visual and performing arts embodied so fully in the Tobin Collection of Theater Arts. Built through the vision and generosity of the late Robert L.B. Tobin, this renowned collection now encompasses more than 12,000 scenic and costume designs, costumes, maquettes, and rare books that span the history of European and American theater from 1600 to today. Robert Tobin's deep love of the theater and his commitment to design as a visual language continue to animate our galleries and inspire our community. Tonight's program would not be possible without the generous support of our longtime partners. We are sincerely grateful to the Tobin Endowment under the leadership of Chair Bruce Bugg, and to the Tobin Theatre Arts Fund led by Mel Weingart, Linda Hardberger, and Robert Perziola. Their vision and generosity sustain not only the Tobin collection, but also this lecture series that brings leading voices in theater design and practice to the McNay. It is a privilege to partner with them in stewarding Robert Tobin's enduring legacy. I would like to also thank Remus Moore, the Tobin Theatre Arts Fund Assistant Curator, and Renee Paul-Berrio, Head of Curatorial Affairs, who created the fascinating exhibition, Designing Shakespeare Through the Ages, now on view, and who have been instrumental in overseeing tonight's program. This evening, we are honored to welcome Oskar Eustis, a towering figure in American theater and a passionate advocate for its civic and transformative powers. Oskar has served as the artistic director of the Public Theater in New York City since 2005, and for more than 4 decades, he has championed groundbreaking work that speaks directly to the moral, political, and social challenges of our times. From commissioning Angels in America while at the Eureka Theater in San Francisco, to producing Tony Award-winning shows like the 2009 revival of Hair, Fun Home, and the universally loved Hamilton at the Public, Oskar has continuously nurtured playwrights and performers who shape the cultural conversation. He has also expanded access to theater in profound ways, from Shakespeare in the Park to the Mobile Unit, which stages free and accessible professional theater productions and programs in local neighborhood venues such as parks, correctional facilities, and community centers across all 5 boroughs of New York City. A scholar as well as a producer, Oskar Eustis has taught at NYU, UCLA, Middlebury College, and Brown University. And in 2017, he was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame, recognizing a career of rare breadth, intellect, and impact. Tonight's lecture, titled Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, explores how theater artists have continually used Shakespeare to meet their historical moments and how they are doing so today. It's a fitting conversation for the McNay, where our current exhibition, Designing Shakespeare Through the Ages, draws directly from the Tobin collection and affirms our belief that Shakespeare's works and stage design itself remain vital, contemporary, and deeply resonant. As he recently remarked when planning his visit, quote, "San Antonio has been an inspiration for urbanists and artists for decades, a beautiful model of a city embracing culture in many forms." We couldn't agree more. So please join me in welcoming to the McNay and to San Antonio the 2025 Tobin Distinguished Lecturer, Oskar Eustis.
Thank you. That guy who's going to talk tonight sounds great. Thank you all for having me here, and I have to say, having just been introduced to the wonders of the Tobin collection, and just even the idea of this kind of theater collection existing within a museum, I'm a little flabbergasted. Okay, so I'm not talking loud enough. We hardly started and I'm failing. I'm just saying I get quiet when I get sincere. That's the problem. I was just saying I'm flabbergasted by the existence of the Tobin collection here. The fact that a museum is paying this much attention to the theater is a almost unique and really beautiful thing. I love the exhibition, and my mind is afire at how more work can end up here, because the theater, as you know, is an incredibly ephemeral art, and we've grown accustomed to it vanishing, but it's really nice when we see it not vanish too. So thank you for having me here. I'm going to start with the summer of 2020, which was a difficult summer for many of us. And in my theater, I had which is the New York Shakespeare Festival Public Theater, I had a staff in full-blown revolt. One of the many ways that my leadership was questioned was in our choice of playwright. Why were we the New York Shakespeare Festival? Why should we be privileging this dead white European, presumably straight male? Why weren't we doing other classic works from other cultural traditions? And these questions were being hurled at me with a particular amount of venom, which had hitherto been reserved from my career. And many of you, I think, can relate to this. But also, exactly at the moment when actually the staff had no desire whatsoever to hear me talk. So it was a hard thing to do. And my associate artistic director, who's really brilliant, Sahim Ali, who is Kenyan, was born and raised in Kenya, he's also an American citizen now, just said to me very quietly, he said, "Oskar, do you mind if I call a meeting on this subject?" And I said, "Be my guest, Sahim." So he called an all-staff meeting to discuss the role of Shakespeare at the Public Theater. And of course it was on Zoom because it was the summer of 2020, but there were 180 people gathered. And Sahim opened the meeting by saying, "We're going to have a full and frank discussion about why Shakespeare, we should be doing Shakespeare, whether we should be doing something else, because mostly the repertory of the public is Shakespeare and brand new work. That's pretty much all we do." And he said to the staff, "Would it be okay if, just to kick us off, if I just talked for a couple of minutes about what Shakespeare meant to me growing up in Nairobi?" And of course the staff said, "Sure." And he talked for about 5 minutes about what Shakespeare meant to him growing up in Nairobi. By the time he was done telling this story, we then had a lively hour-long discussion about how we could get Shakespeare to more people across New York City. The idea of not doing Shakespeare vanished because the first-person testimony from this young African about what it meant to him to learn, to understand, and to begin to feel ownership of this writer and to feel like Shakespeare belonged to him was so powerful and so persuasive that my staff remembered that they worked for the New York Shakespeare Festival. Which again, in the summer of 2020, that was hard. But that doesn't solve the problem for the nation. The number of Shakespeare productions in the last 5 years is decreasing at a terrifying rate. It is less than half this year what it was in 2019. And it had been going down before that. There is a danger that I see of really a historical rupture. And I say danger because I think it would be a terrible thing if this change happened. So I want to talk a little bit about why Shakespeare, about the role that Shakespeare can serve now, and I hope it's of enough interest to provoke some discussion when I'm done talking. So before we talk about whether we should do Shakespeare, let's talk about why we can talk about Shakespeare, because I'm in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm talking about Shakespeare with a fair degree of confidence that this is a room full of people who know who I'm talking about, a dead playwright, 400 years dead, from another country, from another continent. And as a matter of fact, I've spoken on every inhabited continent on the face of the earth in rooms with that same confidence. So whether we should keep doing Shakespeare or not, Shakespeare has spread across the globe and is known everywhere where theater is done or where literature is read. Why? And there's really two different ways of answering this, and one of them is pretty brief. There was a big storm in the English Channel in the summer of 1588, and it pretty much knocked out the Spanish Armada, and it pretty much ended Spain's attempt to triumph over England and establish their supremacy. And it led directly to the triumph of the English-speaking people, both in the continent and across the world. And there is no way to completely separate the triumph of the greatest writer in the English language from the triumph of the English-speaking people economically, politically, militarily. English has become the language of the planet. The English-speaking peoples have dominated the planet in many, many ways, and our writer has become the best-known writer on the face of the earth. You can think whatever you think about that. You can judge that any way you want, but it is a historical fact, and that fact is really important because it means there's an awful lot of conversations, cultural conversations, that you can't enter into without having some grasp of the greatest writer in the English language. But there are also nicer reasons that Shakespeare, because he is an extraordinary artist, and there's never before or since been a writer like him. And I want to talk about some of those reasons. And most of them rest in the artistic laboratory that was Elizabethan London. And there were certain conditions that happened there that came together that created this alchemical reaction. And the first, weirdly, was that because of the Catholic-Protestant struggles that were happening in England, the civil wars that had happened before Elizabeth took the throne, something they called the Tudor Compromise happened, which essentially was the Elizabethan version of don't ask, don't tell. You can be a Catholic as long as you're not a Catholic in public, and as long as you don't talk about it, and as long as you never, ever, ever try to replace me on the throne. And so there was a kind of peace, and the Civil War ended, and to a great extent, the conspiracies ended, not completely. In order to keep this peace, religion was banned as a subject on stage. And paradoxically, by banning religion as a subject, and religion had been the only subject for the mystery plays, that was all that was talked about on stage. Now suddenly you couldn't talk about religion. And that led to, not by intention, an explosion of free speech on the stage. Because once you couldn't talk about religion, it also meant you didn't have a doctrine that you had to support on stage. You could start writing about all sorts of things which there were not doctrinal answers to. So a freedom took place on the stage. The second is, for the first time, capitalism is beginning to rear itself. There start to be businesses and profit-making enterprises. And Shakespeare's Globe was a business. The theater was a business that was owned by 6 people, and then the company was a separate business, the Lord Chamberlains and later the King's Men, which was owned by 8 people. They overlapped, but they were 2 separate things. Shakespeare was a co-owner of both, and they needed to make money in order to survive. Now, but it was mixed, kind of very interesting. They were not allowed to perform without a license from the Crown. And they were one of 2 companies that got that license in London. But then they were not completely supported by the Crown by any means. They had to sell tickets. So you had this strange situation where for the first time in 2,000 years, for the first time since 5th century Athens, they were cultivating and required to speak to an audience that included all classes of society. So Shakespeare's company had to talk to the Queen, to the aristocrats, to the Cambridge and Oxford graduates, and to the illiterate groundlings who they had to collect their pennies in order to survive. Everybody at once was in the theater at the same time. That's the most diverse audience that the planet had seen in 2,000 years. And Shakespeare needed to talk to them all at the same time. Because that's the thing about theater. It's a time-based art, right? I was actually, in my high school, this may happen to some of you, I was taught very earnestly that the different parts of Shakespeare's plays were for the different audiences. That the prose, comedy stuff from the clowns were for the groundlings, and then the high, sophisticated poetry was for the educated people and the aristocrats and so on. And it wasn't until I was making theater that I started to question these statements. Any of you who have actually watched a play know that a play doesn't work if half the audience checks out for sections. That's for those guys over there. I don't know, honey, what are you thinking about? Okay, that's not a successful play. Any successful play has to keep the audience as a whole with them all the way through. Not only keep them, part of what a play is a machine for turning an audience, into a collective, right? The thing that a play does is take individual people who walk into a theater, and you're all individual, we'll come in with our own busy days and the things we're doing, and if a play works, it turns us into a collective. And we know this also from our own experience, right? My friend Bob Brustein used to talk about this. If you walk into a movie theater and it's empty, you go, gotcha, because you can spread out and your popcorn's all over, and if it's stadium seating, I can put my legs over the seat in front of me, which is at heaven, and it's just me and my movie. If you go to the theater and you walk in and the theater's empty, your heart sinks. You think, oh, can I get out of here? Will they notice if I leave? And it's not because you think, oh my God, it must be so bad because nobody came. No, it's because whether you know it or not, you were coming to be part of an audience. That's what you wanted out of this evening. You wanted that experience of laughing with 500 other people at the same time, or crying with 500 other people, or, is my absolute favorite, holding your breath to see what happens next when everybody else is holding their breath. And the doctors in the audience should definitely take note, because I promise you those moments cure every cough on the face of the earth. You get a moment that works like that, nobody ever coughs. And it's why we hate when there is coughing through the audience, because nobody thinks that they're coughing because they're commenting on the play, because I've done it. I think, oh, I'm just coughing, I feel so bad, I wish I wasn't coughing. But what's actually happening is I'm coughing because I'm not fully engaged. And we know it. So you're coming there to be part of an audience. So Shakespeare is not just writing different parts of the play to appease this, but he's writing to try and make everybody aware of what they have in common with each other. And again, you don't think that when you're in the audience. You don't think, oh my gosh, I have so much in common with the king, or I have so much like that aristocrat who's also holding his breath. It's a unconscious message that you're getting, but it's a really powerful message. And it's one of the things that I think is the superpower of the theater when it works. It links people together viscerally, and you walk out of the theater feeling better, not just because the play has uplifted you, not just because you've had an emotional experience, because you felt the sense of, oh my gosh, I have all this in common. I am like all these other people who are in the audience. And Shakespeare had to do that for a huge diversity of people at the same time. And it was that audience that turned the very fine poet, William Shakespeare, into the greatest playwright that we've ever had. And this even becomes, at a certain point, the subject of some of the greatest plays that Shakespeare wrote, the history plays. But particularly his great tetralogy, Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V. He's actually working out what gives a king the right to rule. What does a king have to do to deserve to be king? What makes a good king? And he actually works it out in the course of the play. And many of you will know the St. Crispin's Day speech, the Band of Brothers speech. That's the climax of that. And what Henry V figures out is that what gives you the right to rule in England is that you share your destiny with your people. That's what gives you the right to rule. Not that you're above them and separate from them, but that you're among them. And that, I am shocked to say, but it is true, that doesn't just become a theatrical experience. This becomes essential to Englishness. This becomes how English people define who they are. The Duke of Wellington famously said, "The only English history I know is what I read in Shakespeare, and that's all I need to know." He helped define a nation by doing that. It's really extraordinary. Oh, I don't have to go back there because I got my book here. So it's also, another factor. He's one of two companies. The Lord Admiral's Men is the other company in town, and both companies, we don't know exactly why, but they had the same structure. They were owned by a small group of people, but they had 16 to 18 permanent actors as part of the company, year-round on salary. And, you know, we know so little about the casting of Shakespeare's plays. It's incredibly frustrating. You know, we know a few details. Will Kemp was his clown, and in the first part of his career. Will Kemp played Falstaff. And then Will Kemp, we think, had a big fight with Shakespeare and left the company. And it explains one of the mysteries is that at the end of Henry IV, Part 2, the epilogue promises the audience that next play you're going to see the adventures of Falstaff in France. And then Henry V happens, and it opens with a bunch of people saying, oh, Falstaff died, and they tell the tale. And, you know, I've read tons of essays, you know, think, why did Shakespeare decide to do it? It's easy. Will Kemp quit the company. He didn't have Falstaff anymore. He couldn't put Falstaff in the show. And the other thing I love speculating about is about 1596, he got two young men or boys in the company who played the women. And he wrote a series of parts, Rosalind and Celia, Gertrude and Ophelia, Viola and Olivia in Twelfth Night, Cleopatra and Iris. Extraordinary. And you just think, those two boys, what actors they must have been to make Shakespeare write those parts. But so, all of these actors have to be employed in every show. So I've spent my career doing Shakespeare. So, you know, I come up with the 1618 not out of the documents, although they don't contradict that, but because doing Shakespeare over and over, you find out that's how many people you need. You need 16 to 18 actors to do these shows. And then if you have enough wealth, you can add 10 spear carriers and some extras to beef it up. But 16 to 18. So that means that every time Shakespeare does a play, he's putting a society on stage. There's no such thing as a private relationship in Shakespeare. There's no such thing as two people fall in love and it's just their business. Romeo and Juliet fall in love, and everybody who falls in love with Shakespeare, it's their family's business, it's their prince's business, it's their state's business. It involves everybody. And so when he's writing about personal relationships, they are always in the context of much more than just the personal relationships. And at my advanced age, I have come to believe that that's a much more realistic depiction of how life works. I've been married 30 years. I can tell you, my in-laws are absolutely, they're significant. I mean, it's not a mother-in-law joke I'm making here. You know what I mean? They're actually, and my family, this is a really significant part of how our lives, me and my wife and kids, our lives have been built together. And Shakespeare, every play is like that. So that company and that way of looking at it makes him write plays that infinitely open up. So that's another thing. He was an actor. And as near as we can tell, he acted with the company all the way through until he retired and went back to Stratford. And so that means he's writing from an actor's point of view. And so every one of his characters, he's incapable of writing somebody who's not three-dimensional. He tries to. He hates Shylock, and he tries to make Shylock just a villain, and he can't do it. He's got to write those speeches that make you connect to Shylock. The only time he succeeded was very early in his career in the Henry VI plays. Joan of Arc is a demon. He hated the French so much. I'm serious, I think and he hated the idea of a girl Frenchman beating the English army, that he just could, okay, she's a devil, and she's not a human being. But she's the only one I've been able to find Shakespeare. Every time he writes a character, they have their point of view. They're human beings. They're three-dimensional. And I think he does that because he's an actor, and he does that for another reason, those 16 to 18 other actors. Because he never writes down a line of dialogue without knowing who he's writing it for. He hears the voice of the actor he's writing for. And as a matter of fact, he probably is going into rehearsal saying, hey, Burbage, would you just do this to be or not to be thing? I just wrote it last night. I just want to hear how it sounds. Oh, no, I got to change it. You know, he's actually writing for the voices of the people he's working with. Hard to make that inhuman, hard to make that one-dimensional when these are people you know and live with. And make no mistake, for him, the performance was the work of art. This is the greatest writer in the history of the English language who, as near as we can tell, never gave a thought to the written version of anything he ever wrote. He never oversaw the publication of a single thing in his lifetime. None of his plays were legally published until years after his death, when a couple of the actors in the company put together the first volume. There were pirated versions around that, you know, people put together and sold to try and make a quick penny. The copyright laws weren't very good, so there you go. But Shakespeare didn't care. And why didn't he care? Because that was just, it's like a review or something. I was reading somebody's notes. The work of art was the performance, what actually happened on stage. That, you think of it a little bit like classical music. Beethoven, the pages that the Ninth Symphony are written on, that's not the work of art. That's the instructions for the work of art to be made, the score. And that, you put all of these things together, and you start seeing that he is a unique set of circumstances that is giving birth to this extraordinary body of work that is Shakespeare's, that is, as far as I can tell, incomparable. I guess there's 2 points. Then why don't we show? He had, in a way that I've never seen another playwright, something Keats called the negative capability. The ability to hold completely contradictory thoughts in his head without feeling that he had to resolve them. And it's what drives a lot of directors and critics nuts, because you can't figure out what Shakespeare believed. You can't figure out what he thinks his play's morals are, or what the truth is. He's weirdly almost invisible. And it's because he's capable of inhabiting one point of view and then inhabiting the other point of view, and he doesn't feel like he has to resolve it. He doesn't feel like it's his job to do closure on that. He's delighting in the contradictions. And that means that the plays are open to be interpreted over and over again. T.S. Eliot, who was wrong about so many things, famously said that Hamlet is a bad play. And Hamlet is a bad play because it lacks an objective correlative. There's nothing in the action of the play that explains why Hamlet feels so bad. So it's a bad play. Well, I think about 400 years of humanity contradicts that. It's why the play is open to endless interpretations, endless versions of how to think about that, how to think about that day, and how to think about the way he's thinking, think about the world around him, and how Shakespeare's plays, like no other writer I know, can take on the color of different historical moments, different societies, because those contradictions are not neatly wrapped up. They are laid out as human problems, and therefore, although I will say, at the risk of, well, no, I'll just say this. Shakespeare had one son, he was the twin of Judith, whose name was Hamnet. Hamnet died at the age of 10, 2 years before he wrote Hamlet. And you look at some of the things Hamlet says, and Hamlet says, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. And I can just tell you, the feelings of despair, of grief, of loss, if you think about these as the feelings of a father to his lost son, they make utter sense. But of course, in the play, it's a son for a father. So everybody around him was saying, why are you feeling so bad? It doesn't make any sense. Father's dying naturally, but you're feeling it's unnatural. Shakespeare, like the brilliant writer, is taking feelings that he has and he's changing the context for them. So, and he's letting the other people in the play notice that it doesn't make sense. So he's just breaking open things. And then he has that son talking to his father over the barrier between death and life, and that conversation. Because we're a romantic people, theater people, our legend is that Shakespeare played the ghost. And who knows? But we get these little clues as to the elements that Shakespeare might have been working with, but they weren't elements that were about autobiography. They weren't elements that were about closure or answering things. They were elements about blowing things open. I can't help mentioning this because since I'm on it, we do have a little evidence that suggests that his father was a recusant Catholic. So a document was found in the ceiling of his father's house about 50 years after he died, where he made a secret pledge to the Catholic Church. And you had to do this if you were Catholic, because what it did was by doing this, you were granted dispensation to lie. You were allowed to lie about being a Catholic without committing a sin, because you had to do it in order to protect yourself. So we really do believe that his father was a recusant Catholic. And then there's Stephen Greenblatt pointed this out. Hamlet's father is where exactly? Hamlet's father seems to be in purgatory. He's not in hell. He's certainly not in heaven. He seems to be in purgatory. Purgatory is entirely a Catholic place. As a matter of one of the defining things about Protestantism is they don't believe in purgatory. So, as Greenblatt says, he's writing a play about a Catholic father trying to convince a Protestant son to do what he thinks is right. It's so rich. Show me another playwright you can do that with. So, all of these things have helped make his plays malleable. They can take on different colors, different tones in different societies without feeling alien. I'm going to just start to give a couple of things. Let's look at the Scottish play. Orson Welles did a famous production that was known colloquially as the Voodoo Macbeth in 1939. And it's actually, what's really appropriate is we shouldn't be calling it Orson Welles' production, because we now know enough about it to know that the Haitian company that he directed really were making this themselves. I mean, it was Welles' idea to give them Macbeth, but it was a huge hit in the early days of the Federal Theatre Project in New York. And the story of the Scottish play translated perfectly into this Haitian Santeria culture and was incredibly powerful. Many of you may have seen Kurosawa's film Throne of Blood, which sets Macbeth in the samurai period in Japan. Or Suzuki's the theater director did a fantastic Macbeth. It's translated all over. The characters also can be so rich. We were talking about, I saw it's not a theater. I saw Macbeth in London a couple of years ago, and I thought I knew this play backwards. And one of the things I knew is the last couple of acts are always a disappointment. Once you get past the banquet scene and Banquo and Ghost and all that, it's sort of all over, right? I mean, it's like, it's not going to end well. Things, morally, Macbeth has just murdered Banquo and tried to murder Fleance. He's not going to become badder. It's just, we're just waiting for the cleanup. Well, what this brilliant actor at the Almeida in London did was he played a Macbeth that I had never seen before. He wasn't brave or cowardly or ambitious. He was being overwhelmed by anxiety. And what you saw in the fourth and fifth act was literally a leader who who was being overcome by panic attacks. And he was playing it so powerfully, I almost had a panic attack in the audience. It almost triggered me. And it made the fourth and fifth acts just astonishing, because what you were watching was a leader disintegrate in a way that, and the effect it was having on everybody around him was not at all stereotypical, like, put on the armor and fight. It was like literally watching a man whose own soul had been devoured by his actions, so there was nothing left but fear. It was extraordinary. I said, my friend Alex Author actually did a Hamlet that I saw a couple of years ago, when very first soliloquy, oh, that this too solid flesh. He went, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve. His Hamlet was a writer. He was rewriting himself as he went through. It's just beautiful. It just opened up a whole different way. The soliloquies were not pure expression, not just somehow spontaneous. They were him writing what his own experience was. And I can't tell you just how much that changed. I could keep going on. And one more example I have to tell you, because this one I love so much, and it's actually in the exhibition. You got to see this. A couple of Jess Goldstein's costumes from our production of Merchant of Venice, which we did with Al Pacino in 2010 in the park, are in the exhibition. Dan Sullivan directed it. And Merchant is a difficult show to do, right? Because even though the show is not anti-Semitic, the play is not anti-Semitic, it's set in a very anti-Semitic world. And you have to cope with that if you're going to produce it now. And what Dan, the director, said to me at a certain point, said, you know what? This is a play that's just slipped categories. Because in the first folio, it's under comedies. Because Shylock gets his comeuppance and everybody gets married, happy ending. And that's what doesn't work anymore. So what Dan did was, and is so respectful of the text, he just put on stage something, as the last image of the show, something that's described in the text, which is Shylock's forced conversion. And they forcibly baptized Al Pacino on stage. And it was violent and ugly and humiliating in this pool of water. And at the end of it, Al just stood up as an old man covered with water, shamed, humiliated, lost his daughter, lost his money. And he picked up his yarmulke and he put it back on, and he just walked right into this gang of thugs and blacked out. And it was brilliant, because it wasn't rewriting the play. It was just actually lifting up what was in the play and say, we're still going to do the play, but we can't look at it now the way it looked 400 years ago. It looks different now, but it's still the same play. And that's the key, I think, to trying to make a Shakespeare that makes sense. There's been a raft of... Sorry, my watch got covered up. There's been a raft of productions. There's one thing set of productions we call sometimes costume conceptualizations, and that's the idea that if you set a Shakespeare play in a certain period of time, in a certain country, and get the costumes right, or get the costumes right, that's a concept. It's not a concept, it's just costumes. This is not a well-known play, but I'll try to. A perfect example of this for me was a production of Troilus and Cressida I saw, and everybody involved will remain nameless, that the director decided to set during the Greek Civil War that was immediately after the Second World War. And the Greeks were the revolutionaries, and the Trojans were the establishment, the capitalists trying to hang on to power. And this led, great sweaters, great caps. There were a number of the actors who just, if they'd put their phone numbers in the programs, they would have had no problem with having dates for months. But it led to this one moment that was just staggering, where there's a famous speech that Ulysses makes in Troilus and Cressida, the bee speech, where he describes the proper order of society being modeled on a beehive, and everybody knowing their place and everything. And in this concept, this is supposed to be a Greek communist revolutionary giving the speech about the beehive being how you, it just absolute nonsensical. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And it's a perfect example of a applied idea on top of the play that all it does is sort of mush what the play means down and flatten it down and, make you cross your eyes and not understand it. It doesn't open up and help you understand the play better. And that's what a good idea for a play, that's what an interpretation has to do. And by the way, we have to interpret them. Why? Because of what I said before about the performance. The thing about the theater as an art form is it always, not sometimes, always happens in the moment, in the place where it's happening. You can't do it the way it was done. You can't do it like it was done originally. You can't be there. We're always here and now. The theater condemns us to that. Doesn't mean you have to always dress in modern clothes. Doesn't mean you have to always, have a radical interpretation. But it does mean that you're always in this moment doing a play. And whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's any other kind of play, that means you always have to answer the same question. Why are you doing this? And we have to do that for every play we do. And if we don't do it, believe me, it shows by the time we're done. That one of the things that you can feel in an audience is if the people making the play don't know why they're doing it, you wouldn't necessarily articulate it that way, but it's diffuse. It feels like people are in different plays. It's unfocused. The event somehow doesn't happen. So you have to answer that question, whether you're putting things in contemporary clothes or you're having everybody dress in Elizabethan dress, whether everybody is the same race or everybody is different race, no matter what, you have to answer that question. But then that leads to another thing that has been happening a lot recently, which we could call casting concepts, which is somehow the idea that by casting people of a certain identity, by that alone, you've had an idea about the play. Equally foolish. It's simply not true. It simply doesn't change a play, open up a play, let you understand a play by doing something that is a broad brushstroke casting. Now, don't misunderstand me. Casting underrepresented, non-traditional folks in roles as an issue of fair employment is a moral and legal necessity. I completely believe in that. And there have been many examples of targeted, smart use of people's identity on stage to open up issues about the play. But that's opening up issues about the play. It's not, again, brushing the idea of identity over everything as if that somehow gives you a get-out-of-jail-free pass for understanding and illuminating what the play is about. But when you can do it, and people do it with Shakespeare, it's the most powerful thing in the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to skip some of the boring stuff now. And sorry, I do it because I do want to get to a little bit of discussion. And I'm going to take the liberty of moving on to talking about a subject that I'm certain I know about, which is my own theater. The Public was founded in 1954 by Joe Papp, and he was a Jewish kid who grew up in Brooklyn. His parents didn't speak English. Yiddish was the language at home. He went to high school. He has a high school diploma. Fell in love with Shakespeare because his high school teacher, who was actually a playwright, Eulalie Robinson, who had been prominent in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. Joe Papp's English teacher at high school in Brooklyn was a woman named Eulalie Robinson, who was a black playwright of some prominence in the 1920s in the Harlem Renaissance. But when that finished, she had no employment, she had no money, so she started teaching high school in Brooklyn. Young Yosel Paparovsky, Joe, was her student, and she introduced him to Shakespeare. and he started memorizing Shakespeare, fell in love with the stuff he was memorizing, partly because it's how he really improved his English, lost his accent, and then went to the Navy to fight World War II. And by the way, he was on an aircraft carrier, and he directed a show with Bob Fosse in it. And if I could go back and see that, got demobilized after the war in LA, came back to New York, started working as a stage manager for CBS television, and started doing some Shakespeare in the evening in his spare time, what was called the New York Shakespeare Workshop, because he believed that Shakespeare would make everybody better. And he was part of this post-war optimism. The GI Bill was moving things along. Lots of good things were happening in the post-war period. And so for 2 or 3 years, they were making, first of all, they were just doing workshop, then they started making plays. They started touring around to the parks of New York City on the back of a flatbed truck. And Joe actually bought a garbage truck and tied a big, flatbed to the back of it and drove that around the city, and they'd set up in a park and they'd do Shakespeare, and it actually started attracting a real following, a real audience. And the way he told it, and this is an exaggeration, the garbage truck broke down in Central Park by the side of the turtle pond where the thing is now, and they just started performing there. So this is great until the winter of 1957, 1958. When Robert Moses, who was the commissioner of the parks, that title does not begin to tell you how powerful he was. He's the most powerful person in the history of New York, announced that Joe, the New York Shakespeare Festival, could not do free Shakespeare in the park, that they had to charge. They had to charge for it, and they had to split the cost of the ticket with the Parks Department so they could reseed the grass. Joe announced that to even charge a nickel would be violating the spirit of the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the fight was on. Over the course of the winter of 1957-58, this struggle made the front page of the New York Times 7 times. It became a cause célèbre. Thousands of packets of grass seed got sent to Robert Moses. And for those of you who are into this kind of thing, this is at exactly the same moment that down in Washington Square, Jane Addams has organized the Mothers of Washington Square Park to stop Robert Moses from making Fifth Avenue drive all the way through Washington Square Park down to the Battery. So there's starting to be this city movement to take back the city from the master planner. At the end of this period of time, Joe wins in court. And the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York State, rules that Moses has behaved in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and that we are legally entitled to perform for free in Central Park, which we've been doing for 66 years ever since. Joe then turned around and asked Moses for $25,000 to build a theater, and he gave it to him. So we built the Delacorte Theater there, and we've just been closed for 22 months refurbishing it, and we're going to reopen in August. We just had our big gala last night. It was fantastic. But here's the thing. The reason that the truth of the story actually is Joe was going to give in, and the brilliant press secretary of the Shakespeare Festival, he was a volunteer, Merle Dubusky, said, "Joe, I will work for free Shakespeare. I will not work for cheap Shakespeare." But the principle there, and that we believe in so strongly, is that by not charging anything, you're actually breaking the basic principle that that's a commodity that you can buy. And you're saying that the culture isn't an object, isn't a thing that you have to buy and own, but it's actually your right to have it. It's part of your possession because you're here in New York. It's a gift economy. It's part of the thing that you get for being here in the city. And I can promise you from my 40 years of sitting in those audiences that it feels completely different because of that. There's a kind of joyous connection between the stage and the audience that is just different. famously tough New York audiences aren't so tough in this context. But that doesn't let us off the hook because, as I keep saying, this transaction only works if it's great. If it's bad, then it means nothing that we're giving it away for free. As I occasionally say, if we ever have an empty seat at the Delacorte, it literally means we couldn't give it away. So it's Meryl Streep and Al Pacino, and it's the best actors, the greatest writer, and the productions are great. If I have to say, we slip up. Sometimes I'm not going to tell you which, but the standard is fantastic, and that idea that this work should belong for free to the city is hugely important. It's a flagpole that we'll never relinquish. But about 5 years after I got there 15 years ago, I realized we had a problem, a victim of our success. This free ticket thing that was created as an access issue has become the hardest ticket to get in New York City. Because you don't have to pay for it, but you have to sleep overnight in line to get one. The line at the latest starts at 5 o'clock in the morning. And if there's any buzz about the show at all, it starts the night before and people sleep in line. And, okay, so great, it's free. We've removed the economic barrier. But the cultural and physical barriers, 98% of the people of New York City can't even consider doing this. So we did some things like put a lot of the seats into a lottery and do bureau distribution sites in the borough libraries, which, by the way, the public library turns out to be a fantastic partner for all sorts of things, and we've loved that. Because we're like the library, right? It was a radical idea at one point that you could walk in and take out books for free, and we're trying to do the same thing. But then the other thing we figured out is that we have to actually go to where the people are. We have to revive the mobile and take it out to prisons, to halfway houses, to the parks. And we started doing that again in 2010. And every person in the public who works on the mobile, their first reaction when they come back is, why do we do anything else? Because it's so extraordinary. I'll give you an example. Measure for Measure, I'm going to pretend you all don't know it, so I'll give you a little bit of brief plots on it. That Angelo, the incredibly uptight replacement Duke in Vienna, has condemned Claudio to death because he slept with his fiancée before they actually got married. This is a little harsh. Isabel, his sister, a nun, comes in to plead for his life. While she's pleading, the extremely righteous Antonio develops an insane lust for her and says he will save her brother if she agrees to give up her virgin patent. And she says, absolutely not. Dearer than a brother's life is a sister's chastity. And she says, I'll scream your infamy to the world. And he says, go ahead, try. Nobody's going to believe you. And you've got overnight to think about it. Tomorrow morning, you let me know, and you either give in or I'm going to kill your brother. And he stalks off stage. When she refuses to give up her chastity in order to save her brother's life, she became very unpopular in the men's prisons really quickly. That was hard. But in the women's prison on the west side of Manhattan, it's gone now, but it was there at the time. In our first performance there, Nicole Wallace, who was playing, wonderful actress playing Isabel, Antonia stalks off stage, and she turns to the audience and says the first line of her soliloquy, "To whom should I complain?" And a woman in the audience shouts back, "The police!" And Nicole looks a little startled, and then just says the next line that Shakespeare wrote, "If I did report this, who would believe me?" And the woman says, "No one." And so partly I'm having this total Shakespeare geek reaction. These were written as call and response. He knew somebody was going to say that, So that's the geek reaction. But the non-geek reaction is what I saw over and over in those prisons. We don't dumb this down. We don't change, we shorten them, but we don't change this language. We don't make these simplistic. This is not, no fear Shakespeare. This is the real thing. And prisoners in every prison we've ever been in get it, care about it, respond to it, own it. And in the men's prisons in particular, where showing emotion is a big negative, the thing I got used to is people would walk in and they'd be sitting like this. And then, a few minutes in, they'd start realizing they understand what's going on. They'd start to go down. And then they'd start to realize they care and are interested in what's going on. And things would change. And somewhere around there, what you can also see is one other thing. Pride. They got Shakespeare. And it's a really important thing. And it leads me to the next program that I want to talk a little bit about. We do a program called Public Works, where and by the way, the mobile unit, we went back out to the parks last summer and were overwhelmed by the demand. We thought we'd get 400 or 500 people. We got 1,800 people surrounding the stages in Astoria and Queens. It was just the hunger for this is enormous. There's just, don't let anybody tell you that it doesn't matter when you make things free. It does matter. And don't let anybody tell you that people don't get Shakespeare or aren't interested in Shakespeare. You do it good, they get it. But we started this other program called Public Works, based on the idea that, okay, it's great that we're giving Shakespeare to folks, but what about trying to actually let them make some of it too? And the core idea behind Public Works is that being an artist is not a binary. It's not that you are or aren't an artist. It's not something that some people have and some people don't. That being an artist is simply a property of being a human being. Some of us are privileged enough to get a lot more time to practice than other people. Some of us have natural gifts that we get to lean on. But it's a continuum. It's just a sliding scale. So in Public Works, we do year-round classes with community-based organizations, and at the end of the summer, we put on a pageant, which is usually a musicalized version of Shakespeare, with 5 of the best professional actors in New York, usually Tony nominees and winners, 5 great professional musicians, and 100 and 150 community members who most of them have never been on stage before, ranging in age from 3 to 93. And it's extraordinary. And part of the power of it is they're playing Shakespeare, and believe me, they know it, standing on the same spot where Meryl Streep stood, standing on the same spot where Al Pacino, where James Earl Jones. They know they're occupying that same stage. And I'm going to stop and start taking questions because my ability to, see, I talk. But one of the most moving evenings of my life was a couple of years back. One of our community partners is a group called the Fortune Society, which focuses on rehabilitating folks back in society after they've had justice issues. And they honored us that night because of the program, which was beautiful. But they did this thing, is they had 10 people who had participated in Public Works over the last decade just get up and each of them do 1 minute about what Public Works had meant to their lives. And of course, I had known all these people now for 10 years. I knew them very well. Not intimately, but I knew them over the course of these 10 years. And they got up and each of them talked about what Public Works meant to them. And the reason that everybody in the public was just sort of dissolved is that it wasn't, it wasn't bullshit. Sorry. It wasn't, everything was so great. It was for all of them. Public Works was one of the things that helped them keep their lives together, along with their church, along with their wife sometimes, along with their, AA group. There were other things. But Public Works was one of the things that kept them out of prison, that kept them holding down a job, that kept them off of drugs. And just hearing that and just knowing that's true. That's true. And it's not just doing a play. It's the community that involves. It's the pride of being able to make something for your community and having that applause. It just, this, and the fact that it's Shakespeare is a huge part of it too. Because that means that they own the greatest writer in the history of the language. So there's a million more things that I could say about this, and there was even some videotapes, but thank you for Jackie and Chris for being able to do it. So thank you. So I am very happy to answer any questions or take this conversation anywhere that you guys might want to take it. Right there in the center, we've got a hand up. Oh, yeah, you guys pick people, actually.
I have a question for you. In today's world, sorry about that, in today's world with Facebook, internet, people are not talking to each other any longer at all. And I'd like to use the topic of Romeo and Juliet. Does Shakespeare relate in today's world? We're not talking to each other, but yet Shakespeare can write something and say, I can't tell you face to face what I really think, what I want to say, but I'll put it in a play. So in general, I'm not speaking to you, I'm speaking to a whole broad audience, as you mentioned that. And second thing, you talk about, you look at up to the 20th century, you had arranged marriages. So arranged marriages, and here's telling people, and the family, the Montesquieu's, they can't marry each other. So in today's world on Facebook, we make a lot of negative comments about different people. But sometimes we make positive comments that people, it's not free for us to say. We're fearful of saying what we want to say in our minds, but on Facebook, we feel more free to say what we want to say.
Well, I have fairly strong feelings about this that are probably at least partially a result of how old I am. I literally think social media is killing us. If I could figure out a way, and I know I could make a list myself of the good that it does, and there's certainly things, there's a lot of disabled people who have access to a kind of communication that they don't have otherwise, and that's fantastic. There's a lot of things we can say, but what I think we just look at our country, and the fact that so much of our discourse has gone to the internet has made us meaner, has made us less tolerant, has made us more self-hating, it's ruining us, and it's ruining civil discourse. And part of the thing that I'm sorry, I'm going to do a non-Shakespeare story for a second. We put on a play last year called The Ally, which was about a Jewish American novelist in the contemporary moment who at a university signed a Black Lives Matter petition without reading the paragraph about Palestine, and much trouble ensues. At the end of the first act it was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize. At the end of the first act of this play, a Hillel student makes an impassioned argument that anti-Zionism is always and everywhere anti-Semitism. The argument is brilliant, deeply felt, very powerful. Intermission. In the middle of the second act, a Palestinian student makes an equally brilliant, deeply felt argument that the establishment of Israel in 1948 was an act of settler colonialism and always has been, and was a racist act from the beginning and needs to be reversed. Powerful. I almost lost my job, but we put this play on. And what happened we could have run it forever if I could have kept the actors. Every time we put a ticket on sale, the audience demand was outrageous. And every night, people in the audience cheered and booed for both sides. And people shouted, people yelled at the actors, it was intense. And for the 9 weeks of the run, not one person walked out. Not one. and nobody tried to stop the performance. And what I felt like is this is the only room in New York, it may be the only room in the United States, where people are listening all the way through to arguments from people they hate. And they're hearing them. Now, is it changing anybody's mind? I don't know. But for me, that was like the definition. Jaw is better than war. You know, listen to what you hate instead of shooting what you hate. And the physical presence is necessary for that. It doesn't work if it's online. First of all, people don't listen to the end. But it's being the physical presence and seeing as a human being and experiencing as a human being people who disagree with you is necessary for a democratic society. I'm sorry, I'm making a speech, but I'll try to get it done quickly. The drama as an art form depends on the idea that nobody has the truth. If anybody has the truth, the play never happens because they just have the truth and it should be over. The drama proposes the idea that the truth is always discovered through the conflict of different points of view. And through that conflict, new points of view emerge that are truer than the points of view that anybody had at the beginning. That's not just a description of an art form. That's a description of what you have to believe if you believe in democracy. And if you don't believe that, you don't really believe in democracy. You really believe that, you know, it should be an authoritarian government if only you could be in charge. And, you know, somehow we've got to get back to that, and we're not going to be doing it over social media. Sorry, you didn't ask me to make a speech.
I have the mic, but it'll go back and, so it's ready. Hi, hello. Thank you so much for this and for visiting us and for continuing this work that you're doing, which I get to enjoy mostly because of social media. So that's one little positive. But I agree with you totally. Although the raccoons at the Delacorte are probably one of the best things about the internet. We're in a room, like you said, everyone has heard of Shakespeare. That's why we reserved our wonderfully gifted tickets for tonight, so we could come and hear you. We're artists and donors and teachers. To your point, what do you say? Because this is free to attend. It is a gift, but someone's paying for it.
Correct.
So how do you explore and really speak truth in satire or blatantly to people who are also giving you money, who may not be comfortable with the things that are being explored? What do you say? And can you write a script for us? Just say.
It's good you asked that because I have that problem completely solved. And it's patented. And if you'll only scroll to the end of the... Listen, there's two things. First of all, I have, over my 50 years of being an artistic director, I have discovered many, many people who disagree with much of what I believe, and yet who I can find points of real solidarity with. I'll use a very public example. There was a couple of years where I was working with the Charles Koch Foundation, who is not, you wouldn't think of us as natural bedfellows, but they actually approached us around issues of free speech. And they said, we don't like a lot of what you believe. We know you don't like a lot of what we believe, but we think we bond on this issue of sort of a First Amendment absolutism. And there were a couple of projects that we both got behind, and we did that, and it actually felt great. Then they decided to stop doing it, so it was temporary. But, you know, part of it is just recognizing that the only times I've regretted this is, you know, we took money from those OxyContin people. And as soon as we knew what was going on, we gave it back at that point to the receiver and took the names. When money is used to launder reputations, that can't happen. But otherwise, I mean, people shouldn't have to believe the same thing to support the arts. And it's not like, we're walking around, everything we do is some kind of, burn down the house. Actually, nothing we do is about burning down the house. It's about community, it's about connection, it's about trying, for God's sake, to get away from this polarization that we have. And this is a moment where, honestly, there's a particular class of billionaires, some of whom used to support us, who no longer do. And I hope that's not a permanent thing, not just because I hope they support us, but because I hope we don't get more and more divided, because that's going to be very, very bad for all of us.
I think that is the perfect end.
Thank you. Thank you very much.